knuckles crashed into the side of Nora Vance's neck and snapped her head hard enough that her cheek struck painted cinder block with a flat, hollow sound that traveled the corridor. She hit the wall shoulder first, slid, and lost the breath she needed for the next second. Her inhaler was in the pocket of her coat, on the bench by interview room 3, 6 steps away, and Bryce Hartwell's hand was already on her before she could curl toward it. His palm clamped over her jaw and throat, thumb digging under her chin, fingers pressing where her pulse raced wild against skin too thin to hide panic. Floor tile chilled her through thin leggings. His other hand caught her left wrist and pinned it down so hard she felt the seam of grout bite into bone. She twisted anyway because 8-year-old bodies knew survival before they knew language for it, and because her mother had taught her one thing over and over when sirens passed their old apartment at night: always keep one side free. Keep. Nora tried to turn onto her right hip and bring her knee up between them. Bryce dropped more weight across her chest, and she heard herself make a sound that did not sound like a child, not even like a person, just air squeezed through a blocked opening. "Stop fighting," Bryce said, breath warm and sour above her face. "You're making this worse." Nora's vision narrowed at the edges, violet shadows moving in and out. She tasted copper from where her lip had split against her tooth when she hit the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, relentless and white, flattening every face in the hallway into the same bureaucratic color. The Child Advocacy Center smelled like disinfectant, old coffee, wet wool, and something metallic trapped in the grout. She turned her face toward the floor without meaning to, and there it was again, the rust-colored crescent stain near the baseboard, old blood dried into tile that should have been replaced months ago. Bryce saw her looking at it and pressed down harder. "You say you fell," he hissed. "You always say you fell. You hear me?" She clawed at his wrist with her free hand and found the edge of his watch band, a glossy black strap that cost more than the sneakers she got from donation bins. Her fingers slipped. Her lungs started the frantic rhythm she recognized from every asthma flare, the one that felt like drowning on dry ground. Only air mattered, and she could not get enough. She kicked once, heel thudding against cabinet metal, and the noise echoed toward the intake desk. No one came. Her body remembered all the other places this had happened. Bathroom tile at his house, back seat of the SUV when she spilled juice, laundry room concrete, always after he closed the door, always after he said she made him do it, always after he mentioned forms and signatures and how nobody would believe a child already moved through 3 placements in one school year. He was 26 and wore clean white designer sneakers and a leather jacket with stitched panels and silver zipper teeth. He smiled in photos with hospital administrators and charity boards. In this hallway, his face was red with effort and annoyance, like she was a task that refused to stay completed. Her chest spasmed. She coughed against his palm and got almost nothing in. She thought of the toy ambulance in her backpack, the small plastic one with one wheel missing, the one that had belonged to her brother before the pneumonia took him 2 winters ago. She brought it to school every day and touched it under the lunch table when the cafeteria got loud. She had forgotten it in the foster car this morning. For one bright second, panic sharpened into a practical thought. If she got up, she could still grab her coat, her inhaler, maybe run to the women's restroom and lock the stall. Bryce leaned close enough that she could see stubble along his jaw. "You want to stay with me?" he whispered. "Then act right." His knuckles lifted and slammed once more into the side of her shoulder, not to injure now, but to remind, to reset control. Pain shot down her arm, and her hand opened on reflex, fingers splaying over the stained tile beside the rust crescent. The center's wall clock clicked loud in her ears. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a copier spat paper. Ordinary sounds, office sounds, sounds of systems that preferred routine to interruption. Nora bucked again, hard enough that his grip slipped from full throat to jawline. A thin thread of air reached her, and she dragged it in with a ragged, whistling pull that made her own chest hurt. She heard shoes scuffing nearby, many shoes, and for one raw instant she thought someone was finally kneeling, finally pulling him off her, finally saying her name. No one touched him. Through the blur at the edge of her vision, she saw a crowd in the corridor outside interview room 3. Too many adults to track, maybe 14, all of them still while he held her down and told her what story to tell. 2 intake workers in badge lanyards stood beside the sign-in counter with clipboards pressed to their ribs like shields. A county deputy with sergeant stripes planted himself near the fire door and stared at Bryce's shoulder instead of Bryce's hand. A night nurse from pediatrics held a packet of discharge instructions and took 1 half-step backward when Nora's sneaker heel scraped the floor. A contracted therapist in a soft gray cardigan lifted her hand to her mouth, then let it drop and said nothing. Foster system staff waiting on transfer paperwork formed a tight line along the opposite wall, all posture and no movement, as if stillness could be mistaken for neutrality. At the vending machine, a caseworker named Lena Ortiz looked down at her tablet and scrolled through a spreadsheet. Her thumb moved steadily. Green boxes, red boxes, status notes. She did not look up even when Nora made that choking gasp again. A man in a county polo fixed his attention on a poster about trauma-informed communication. Another worker adjusted the strap on his messenger bag and watched the floor. The deputy's hand hovered near his belt radio, then dropped. Nobody said stop. Nobody said child. Nobody said, this is an assault in a government building under camera coverage. Bryce spoke like he expected them to freeze, like her voice and her body weighed less than his last name. My father owns this hospital system, he said to no one in particular, voice louder now, almost bored. Everybody here knows the drill. The sentence landed like a stamp. Nora tried to turn her head toward the nurse and could not. Her cheek dragged across tile, skin burning. Skin. She saw the nurse's shoes, white and sensible and very still. She saw one of the intake workers quietly angle her body so her badge faced inward, hiding her name. She saw Lena at the vending machine, pause her scrolling long enough to dim the screen, then bring it back up like she was reopening work that had never stopped. Bureaucracy is alibi. A security camera in a smoked plastic dome watched from the corner of the ceiling. Red indicator light steady. The lens caught Bryce's grip under Nora's jaw, Nora's pinned wrist, the deputy's inaction, the silent line of adults. In review meetings, she had heard words like context, de-escalation, line of sight, uncertainty. On the floor, with his weight crushing her chest, there was no uncertainty at all. Nora's ears rang. Her fingers went numb. She thought, with the blunt clarity that came before passing out, that this was how forms one, a sentence in a file, a closed review, another move to another home with a different hallway and the same hand. Then she heard claws click once on polished floor. At the far end of the corridor, beside a man in Navy NWU Type 3 camouflage with early gray at his temples and a scar through his jawline, Atlas's ears rotated forward and locked. The German shepherd's tan and black coat looked dark as iron under fluorescent light. His body went rigid. A growl started low in his chest, not loud, not frantic, just steady thunder rolling toward a target that had finally been identified in public. No one in that hallway had moved for Nora. Then Atlas moved, Then Atlas moved all 87 pounds of trained restraint into the space between violence and everyone pretending not to see it. His claws touched tile in 3 quiet beats, and each step sounded louder than the copier at the end of the corridor. Nora saw him through a narrowing tunnel. Tan and black saddleback coat, almost black under the fluorescent tubes, head low, shoulders level, ears pinned forward with absolute focus. He did not lunge. He did not bark. The growl stayed low in his chest, steady as distant weather, and that steady sound did what shouting had failed to do. 14 adults finally looked at the same thing. Bryce felt the shift before he understood it. His hand stayed on Nora's throat, but pressure changed. Control became calculation. He turned his head toward the sound with irritation first, then a flicker of something colder when he saw the size of the dog and the leash held by a man in Navy NWU Type 3 camouflage, standing at the corridor threshold like he had always belonged there. Grant Mitchell did not rush. He did not square up for theater. He just arrived, broad-shouldered and still, early gray at his temples, scar crossing his jaw, one hand on Atlas's lead and the other empty, open, ready. The deputy by the fire door took one step sideways without being told. He made room. Nora dragged in a thin breath when Bryce shifted his weight to look up. It whistled in, ragged, enough to keep her conscious. Her left wrist still burned under his grip. Her cheek stayed against cold tile near the rust-colored crescent stain, and her eyes fixed on Atlas because he was the only thing in the hallway that looked honest. His gaze never left Bryce's hands. Not Bryce's face, not the deputy's badge. The hands. "Control your dog," Bryce said, voice tight now, trying to recover the tone he used in board photos and intake interviews. Grant said nothing. Atlas's ears twitched once toward Nora's broken breathing, and then locked forward again. The growl deepened by half a note, not louder, just fuller, a warning from an animal who had seen men hide threats behind polished words. Nora felt it through the floor more than she heard it, a vibration under her ribs that told her she was no longer alone in the danger. Her fingers, numb seconds ago, curled weakly against tile. A case file slid from someone's clipboard and hit the floor. Nobody bent to pick it up. The nurse in white shoes finally moved 2 steps forward, then stopped when Bryce glanced at her. Her hand trembled over the folded discharge packet. Lena Ortiz, still by the vending machine, held her tablet against her chest now instead of scrolling. The therapist in the gray cardigan whispered, "Please." But the word landed nowhere. The county polo man who had studied the trauma poster stared at Grant's uniform and swallowed hard. Bryce adjusted his grip and forced a laugh that didn't convince anyone. "This is a behavioral episode," he said. "She's been dysregulated all day. You people know that." Nora tried to speak and only coughed. Grant's stare did not move from Bryce's hand across Nora's neck. He gave Atlas 2 fingers against the collar, a tiny signal. Atlas shifted half a step, placing himself where Bryce would have to move through him to keep control if Nora slipped free. It was not a trick. It was geometry. Nora did not know that word yet, but she understood what it meant when the line from harm to escape changed shape in front of her eyes. The deputy cleared his throat and failed to speak. His radio crackled once with static, then silence. He looked at Grant, then at Bryce, then at the security dome in the corner, as if waiting for permission from a lens. Grant finally spoke, but not to Bryce. "Nurse," he said, voice level. "Be ready." The nurse nodded once, quick and frightened, and dropped the packet onto the bench where Nora's coat lay, with the inhaler still in its pocket. She stepped closer, palms out, waiting for an opening. Bryce's jaw tightened. "You can't give orders here." Grant still did not look at his face. "Release her wrist." "Who are you?" Grant's answer was silence and posture. the kind that came from years of entering uncertain rooms and deciding outcomes in under a second. He shifted one boot forward, not enough to provoke, enough to close distance. Atlas mirrored him with perfect timing, head lower now, muzzle pointed straight at Bryce's forearm. The dog's restraint was more frightening than any lunge would have been. Everyone in the hallway could see he was waiting for one command and did not care about family names, donor lists, or who sat on what board. Bryce saw it too. His hand on Nora's wrist loosened, then clamped again when he caught himself yielding in public. He looked around for allies and found 14 faces that had gone pale under office lighting. No one backed him with words. No one repeated his script for him. The corridor had become a different country in less than 10 seconds. Nora heard her own heartbeat in her ears. She focused on Atlas's eyes, dark and fixed, and remembered the one rule her mother repeated with shoes by the bed and keys by the door. When help comes, move when they say move. Her chest spasmed again. She coughed twice, shallow, and Bryce cursed under his breath. Grant shifted his weight 1 inch, and the deputy flinched like a rookie hearing incoming for the first time. Grant never raised his voice. "Last chance." Bryce sneered because sneering was what had worked every other time. "You touch me. You're done in this county." Atlas's growl rolled deeper, and the fluorescent hum seemed to drop away. Grant bent slightly at the knees, center of gravity lowering. Every line in his body turned from stillness into readiness. His gaze flicked once to Nora's face, reading skin color, airway, panic. Then back to Bryce's hand. The hallway held its breath. "Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. If you believe vulnerable kids deserve more than stamped forms and quiet excuses, subscribe and stay with this all the way through. What happened in that corridor did not end with one man losing his grip on one child. It tore through a system that had been hiding behind procedure for years. The moment stayed pinned there, stretched so tight that even the ceiling lights seemed to buzz softer around it. Nora on the tile. Bryce over her. Grant and Atlas 4 steps away. 14 adults arranged like a jury that had not expected to be called to account for what they witnessed. For the first time in a long time, the center's hallway stopped behaving like an office and started behaving like a crime scene. Nora felt the cold from the floor climb through her sleeves and into her shoulder, but she held on to one practical fact. The inhaler was still on the bench, and the nurse was now standing between the bench and the wall, close enough to reach her if she could just get loose. Atlas's eyes had marked that too. Dogs did not read case notes. They read pulse, scent, muscle tension, the tiny tremor in a hand about to strike or release. Atlas had already made his assessment, and he had never once graded on politics. The deputy's gaze landed on the security camera dome again. This time he looked away fast, like the red light had turned into a witness of its own. He knew what angle caught what hands. He knew exactly what his report would have to say if this went to review. The moral math in his face was ugly and immediate. Career, command pressure, donor calls, and a child turning blue on county property. He had stood still too long already, and everyone around him knew it. Lena Ortiz took one step off the vending machine wall and knelt to pick up the dropped file. Her fingers shook as she gathered the pages, and one sheet slid out, face up for a second, with a bolded line she could not avoid seeing. Previous injury explanation, accidental fall. She shoved the paper back into the stack and looked at Nora for the first time that night. Shame came late, but it came. The therapist in gray whispered toward Bryce, "Please let her breathe." Her voice broke on the last word. She had sat in rooms with children for years, documented affect, assessed adjustment, coded trauma into reimbursable categories, and she knew the difference between dysregulation and fear. She also knew whose name sat on the building where her office leased space. Her hands stayed empty at her sides. Bryce sensed authority slipping and squeezed harder for 1 second, testing whether fear still answered him. Nora's eyes watered. Atlas took that single change in pressure as new data and edged forward until his shoulder aligned with Grant's knee. No bark, no chaos. Just a line drawn in flesh and training. Grant's voice stayed quiet. Not one more second. The county polo man finally found his voice, but only enough for a whisper. Bryce, let go. He sounded like someone asking a storm to move around his house. No command, no conviction, just fear of being included in what happened next. Bryce looked at him with contempt and then back at Grant. You have no idea who you're talking to. Grant's expression did not change. The scar at his jaw caught the flat overhead light, a pale line against weathered skin. He had spent years in places where titles dissolved under pressure, and only conduct mattered. He did not need to know board rosters. He needed one thing, a hand off a child's airway. Nora's focus flickered. She heard fragments. Shoes shifting, fabric moving, Atlas breathing through his nose. The soft plastic click of the nurse uncapping a rescue inhaler and holding it ready. The smell of disinfectant mixed with dog fur and leather, and for her, that was the smell of possible survival. Grant gave Atlas a quiet command that barely reached human ears. Steady. Atlas held, muscles taut as cable, waiting for the next word that would turn waiting into action. The hallway clock clicked over to the next minute. In bureaucratic time, 60 seconds was nothing. On that floor, it had been a lifetime. If you stay to the end, you'll see exactly how one recovered log, one camera angle, and one dog's refusal to ignore what he smelled forced a county to reopen what it had buried. You'll see who signed what, who deleted what, and who thought a family name could outvote evidence. And you'll see why the growl in that corridor was never random, not once, not ever. Grant drew one measured breath, eyes fixed on Bryce's hand, and shifted forward. Grant shifted forward, and the hallway seemed to contract around that single movement. But the truth of that night had started long before his boot crossed the seam in the tile. Nora Vance was 8 years old and small enough that the sleeves of donated sweaters swallowed her wrists unless she folded them twice. She was left-handed, severe asthmatic, and careful in ways children should never have to be careful. She counted doors in every new building. She mapped exits before she learned where the bathroom was. She slept with one sneaker on because her mother had taught her that rule when sirens were common and rent was always late. If trouble comes, do not lose time looking for your shoes. At school, she kept a plastic toy ambulance in the front pouch of her backpack, the one with a cracked red light and one wheel that clicked instead of rolling. It had belonged to her older brother, Owen, who used to race it across kitchen linoleum while she timed him with a microwave clock. 2 winters earlier, pneumonia took him in 6 days. Her mother put his drawings in a grocery bag and could not open that bag again. Nora took the ambulance to lunch every day after that, set it in her lap under the table, and touched it with 2 fingers when cafeteria noise got too loud. That was how she stayed in the room. By the 2nd week of September, her teacher had started noting the same pattern on behavior logs. Bright in reading, quiet in groups, startled by keys before doors opened. The first emergency room visit happened after recess and was filed as a playground fall. A bruise sat high on Nora's upper arm, oval and thumbed, with a matching mark lower near the elbow where fingers would close if a hand gripped and twisted. The triage nurse wrote accidental injury after Bryce Hartwell answered every question before Nora could. The second visit happened 12 days later, this time for wrist pain and shortness of breath. Bryce said she tripped near the stairs. He wore clean, white designer sneakers and a leather jacket with stitched shoulders and silver hardware that reflected exam room light. He signed forms with impatient taps of a watch that cost more than Nora's annual clothing stipend. On the third visit, a pediatric resident asked Nora to hold a marker and draw a circle. She used her left hand, slow and wincing. When the resident gently rotated her forearm, old bruising surfaced under yellowing skin in a pattern that did not match a simple fall. The resident flagged the chart for forensic follow-up. The chart came back the next morning, marked reviewed, no immediate concern, monitor placement. Nora learned quickly what those phrases meant. Nothing changed. At home in the Hartwell foster house, she learned Bryce's footsteps by rhythm before she learned where cereal bowls were kept. His pace was heavy through the kitchen, faster in the hallway, almost silent when he was angry enough to plan before entering a room. She learned that spilled milk cost an hour of standing still with her nose to the laundry room wall. She learned that coughing too long at night got called performance. She learned that asking for her inhaler twice in one evening could trigger a lecture about gratitude and money and how many kids would kill for this address. She also learned not to cry where mirrors could see her. Bryce liked recording apologies on his phone and replaying them. The girl who could solve multiplication, with her left hand behind her back, began flinching when keys touched a counter. The same girl began packing her school bag at night with methodical precision. Folder, pencil case, inhaler spacer, toy ambulance, one granola bar wrapped in a napkin. Then one sneaker stayed on while she slept, and the others sat pointed toward the door. Children do not build routines like that unless life has taught them to expect raids. At Hartwell Elementary's nurse office, Ms. Delaney once touched Nora's shoulder to check a cough and felt the child recoil before contact landed. She filed a mandated report before the last bell rang. She included the wrist marks, the breathing incidents, and the child's exact phrase when asked where she got hurt. "I fall where walls are close." The intake confirmation number came by email at 6:42 p.m. 3 days later, the report status changed to screened, integrated with existing case activity. No interview at school, no protective hold, no callback. Nora did not know that outcome. She only knew Miss Delaney stopped asking certain questions when pickup time came, and Bryce waited by the office door, smiling at staff like a donor at a fundraiser. October brought colder mornings and tighter chests. Nora's asthma got worse when indoor heat kicked on, and the Hartwell house smelled like cedar cleaner and expensive candles that made her lungs work harder. On one Thursday night, she woke coughing and went to the kitchen for water, dragging one sneaker and one sock across polished hardwood. Bryce appeared in the doorway, took the cup from her hand, and told her to stop making noise. She nodded because air was narrow and words took more oxygen. He said she loved drama, then set the inhaler on top of the refrigerator where she could see it and not reach it. By the end of that month, she had stopped telling new adults the full truth. She gave versions she thought they could survive hearing. She said she was clumsy. She said she bruised easy. She said she forgot where she put her medicine. It was not that she trusted Bryce. It was that she had already watched reports vanish into systems with polished language and branded letterhead. Children noticed quickly which truths cost them more than lies. One afternoon during art period, she drew a hallway with no people in it and one red line on the floor by a wall. When the teacher asked what the line was, Nora said, "Old paint." The teacher nodded because adults often accept the first answer when the second might demand action. That same week, a contracted therapist met Nora for 27 minutes in a room with beanbags and trauma posters. Nora answered with shrugs and one-word phrases while the therapist clicked boxes tied to reimbursement codes. Adjustment concerns, transition stress, attachment disruption. At minute 24, keys rattled in the corridor outside, and Nora folded her arms over her throat without seeming to realize she had done it. The therapist saw. She wrote guarded presentation, recommend continuity. She did not write fear response to auditory cue associated with caregiver approach. That line stayed in her head and out of the chart. A month later, Nora sat on the edge of her foster bed, one sneaker laced, one unlaced, and whispered the same sentence into the dark that she had whispered for almost a year. I can be smaller. I can be quiet. I can make it through tonight. She was 8. She was already negotiating with violence like a hostage. Bryce Hartwell was 26 and had lived his entire adult life inside a machine built before he was born. His father, Dalton Hartwell, chaired the philanthropic arm of Hartwell Health and had his surname on the pediatric wing, where local reporters liked filming holiday donation drives. His mother sat on 2 nonprofit boards and hosted annual child welfare luncheons with centerpieces that cost more than monthly stipends for half the foster homes in county rotation. The sheriff had accepted Hartwell development money during the last campaign cycle, through bundled donors and consulting contracts that were legal on paper and clarifying in practice. County commissioners called Dalton when they needed a ribbon cut. Hospital administrators called him when they needed debt retired. Child services directors called him when they needed budget mercy at the next appropriations hearing. In that ecosystem, Bryce did not need credibility. He inherited it. He arrived at foster orientation late in a leather jacket and mirrored sunglasses, signed paperwork without reading, and joked with supervisors by first name. He spoke in the flat, possessive grammar of people who had never been corrected by consequence. My unit, my placement, my staff. He liked being photographed, handing over backpacks with school logos, and smiling beside children whose names he forgot by Monday. He posted those photos with captions about service, family values, and giving back. Workers saw his temper in private moments and swallowed it. An intake specialist once watched him grab Nora's elbow hard enough to leave marks when the child hesitated near an elevator. The specialist wrote escalating caregiver frustration in draft notes, then changed the phrase to placement stressors after her supervisor reminded her the Hartwell home was high visibility and politically sensitive. The original draft never made the permanent file. 3 days passed before the first expedited review memo appeared with Bryce's home, listed compliant and stable. The memo's timestamp read 8:13 a.m., even though the sign-in sheet showed the reviewer entered the property at 9:02. The discrepancy might have mattered in a county with normal pressure. In this one, it vanished under signatures. The second clearance came 6 weeks later after another injury report from school. Same conclusion. No substantiated concern. Maintain placement continuity to avoid re-traumatization through disruption. The language sounded clinical, even compassionate. In effect, it trapped an 8-year-old with a man who had learned exactly which words institutions used when they wanted to avoid a fight. Lena Ortiz knew how those edits happened because she had made some herself. Not the worst ones, not the direct lies, the softer cuts that made danger read manageable. She sat in a fluorescent rooms at 7 p.m. with stale coffee and a queue of pending cases, while supervisors asked for cleaner phrasing before audits. She told herself she was preserving access to children by keeping her job. She told herself one bolder report from someone else would force the system to move. She told herself many things that sounded professional and felt like surrender. In November, she attended a donor breakfast in the atrium of Hartwell Children's Pavilion because attendance was encouraged. A giant vinyl banner read, "Every Child Safe." Dalton Hartwell shook hands under it and thanked county partners for innovation in foster stabilization. Bryce stood 10 feet away, checking messages, expensive cuff visible as he reached for sparkling water. When Lena caught his eye, he smiled without warmth and tipped his chin as if acknowledging staff. She looked down at her badge and felt, for one hard second, that she was wearing a price tag. The deputy, who later froze in the corridor, had worked secondary security at 2 Hartwell events that season. He had seen Bryce drive through service entrances and park, where fire lanes should stay clear. He had watched dispatch logs get rewritten from warning to advisory after a call from command. He had not connected those favors to an 8-year-old's bruises until that hallway forced the equation in public. Systems rarely announce corruption with one dramatic act. They teach everyone which rules bend for which names. By early December, the county database held 3 ER notes, 2 school concerns, 1 nurse report, 1 therapist continuity recommendation, and 2 cleared home determinations that overruled all of it. Any one item could be explained in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern any honest review would have escalated. The review never came. Bryce understood exactly how protected he was. He said the quiet part out loud because he had practiced the line and watched it work. "My father owns this hospital system. He used it in parking lots, intake rooms, and one case conference where a junior coordinator asked about recurring injuries." After he said it, a supervisor changed the subject to placement resources and holiday gift cards. Nobody challenged him. Nobody documented the threat. Everyone in that room learned again what counted as untouchable. The cruelty was not just his hand. It was the architecture around it. Nor entered the Child Advocacy Center that night with a borrowed coat, 1 frayed glove, and lungs already tight from cold air. Bryce entered with perfect hair, polished boots, and confidence that every corridor in the county eventually bent toward his last name. 14 adults stood within reach when he put a hand over her mouth and throat. 14 adults with training modules, reporting duties, and laminated badges. Most did what the system had trained them to do when Power walked in wearing donor access and legal counsel. They hesitated. And then, in the middle of that hesitation, Grant Mitchell shifted forward, Atlas at his knee, and the balance that had protected Bryce for years finally met something it could not absorb. Grant's step looked small to everyone watching, but it changed the geometry of the hallway. He moved 1 measured pace off the corridor seam, Atlas on a short lead at his left knee, shoulders level, center of gravity low enough that acceleration could happen without warning. Nothing theatrical entered it. Nothing rushed. He closed distance the way men close on unstable machinery, quiet, exact, and already accounting for what could break. Fluorescent light flattened every face in the County Child Advocacy Center corridor outside interview room 3, but Grant's attention stayed on one thing only: Bryce Hartwell's hands. Bryce was still on Nora Vance, 1 knee pinning her thigh, 1 hand at her wrist, the other braced near her collarbone where pressure could tip breathing from compromised to dangerous in a second. Nora was 8 and all angles on the tile, cheek near a rust-colored crescent stain, old enough to have been mopped and old enough not to have left. Her inhaler sat 3 yards away on a bench beside a stack of intake folders and a paper cup sweating onto laminated wood. Close enough to see. Impossible for her to reach. "Say it," Bryce said through his teeth, voice pitched for control instead of volume. You fell. Tell them you fell. Nora tried to answer and produced a thin, scraping intake that caught halfway. Her fingers flexed once around nothing. The toy ambulance Owen used to carry for her before he died lay on its side near the wall where it had skidded out of her hand when Bryce drove her into cinder block. One wheel still spun, then stopped. 14 adults watched. Lena Ortiz stood with a file open against her chest, not reading it now, but seeing it anyway. Accidental, fall language, softened phrasing, edits she had initialed when pressure came down from above and meetings became about optics instead of harm. The contracted therapist hovered half a step behind her, lips moving around something that might have been someone should, and never finished. 2 intake workers had pressed themselves back toward the copier alcove, as if distance could become innocence. A dropped folder lay fanned on the floor by the deputy's boot, forms spread like playing cards nobody wanted to touch. The deputy, Sergeant Stripes dark under fluorescent buzz, had already shifted once to clear Grant's lane. He did it again now, one deliberate slide to his right that opened a clean corridor between Grant and Bryce. He still did not give a command. He still did not put hands on the aggressor. But his jaw worked once, and his thumb rode up the shoulder mic wire, as if his body had finally accepted that camera angle. And hand placement were now evidence, not rumor. Atlas let out a low warning growl that vibrated through the tile. The dog's eyes never left Bryce's forearms. Not his face, not his badgeless chest, not the deputy, not the crowd. Hands, pressure, micro-movements. Atlas tracked each tightening pulse in Bryce's grip the same way he would track the first shoulder dip before a strike. Grant felt the leash response through 2 fingers and gave no correction, only containment. Atlas was controlled on lead precisely where he was meant to be, between Bryce and everyone else who had mistaken silence for neutrality. Bryce snapped his head toward Grant. Control your dog. His tone landed too loud, too quick. Narrative control, not confidence. Grant did not raise his voice. Be ready, he said to the night nurse without looking away from Bryce. Then to Bryce, clipped and level. Release her wrist. The nurse was already moving. She had been waiting for a safe transfer window and now took 2 quiet steps from the bench, rescue inhaler uncapped in her right hand, spacer in her left, body angled so she could drop to Nora without crossing Atlas's path. She stopped at the edge of Bryce's reach and held position, breathing through her mouth, eyes fixed on Nora's chest excursion, like she was counting beats only she could hear. This is a behavioral episode, Bryce said, projecting toward the bystanders. She throws herself. You all know that. No one answered. He pushed harder on Nora's wrist for 1 second, then eased a fraction, when Atlas's growl deepened. That involuntary redistribution gave Nora a narrow breath line. Her ribs lifted once, shallow, then hit resistance again. She coughed dry, eyes watering, and tried to pull her knees under herself, but could not find leverage with Bryce's weight across her. Tell them, Bryce said, leaning in close enough that only the nearest heard. You fell. Grant advanced another half step. He had no use for speeches in moments like this. Years of training lived in tiny arithmetic, distance to contact, angle to airway, where the aggressor's balance would fail if redirected, how fast the dog could intercept a hand before that hand could close. He had done this in worse light and louder places, but the principle stayed constant. Control escalation by denying the next harmful action. Everything else was noise. The deputy finally keyed his shoulder mic. Unit 12, hold hall 3 for medical transfer, he said, voice rough with effort. Not a takedown order, not command seizure. But it was commitment enough to ripple through the witnesses. Heads turned. Someone near interview room 2 whispered, He called it in. Another worker wiped both palms on her slacks and stepped clear of the wall, opening more space behind the nurse. Bryce heard the radio traffic and recalculated. "You know who my father is," he said, aiming it at the deputy this time, then at the room. "Dalton Hartwell funds half this county. You want your jobs? You stop this right now." The words landed exactly where they had always landed. In institutional reflex, in conditioned fear, in the old understanding that influence moved faster than truth. But the corridor did not fully yield this time. Lena flinched. She did not step forward, but she did not look down either. The deputy's eyes cut briefly to the ceiling camera dome, then back to Bryce's hands, as if seeing the same scene from tomorrow's playback, while still trapped in today's hesitation. Grant kept his voice spare. "Release her wrist." Bryce's mouth twisted. "Back off." Atlas shifted his weight a centimeter, hind legs loaded, chest forward, warning still low and steady. Grant felt the coiled intent and touched 2 fingers to the collar line. Acknowledgement, not restraint panic. The dog stilled to that touch the way disciplined force stills to trusted command. Grant had learned over months that Atlas read intent before posture made it obvious. In 3 prior stops at this building, the same rigid alert had surfaced around this same man and this same child. Each time, paperwork diluted it into neutrality. Grant had written his own timestamps anyway. He was writing one now in his head. Nora's face was paling under the fluorescent wash, cyanotic shading at the lips, fast, ineffective pulls that couldn't overcome compression, plus asthma. The nurse dropped to one knee preemptively, inhaler ready at her thigh, waiting for the instant Bryce's forearm cleared enough to deliver. Her eyes met Grant's for less than a second. He gave a tiny downward nod. "Hold." Bryce saw the nod and tightened again out of reflexive dominance. Nora made a strangled sound that was more pressure than voice. "Last chance," Grant said. Bryce's gaze flicked from Atlas to the deputy, to the cluster of staff looking for the old hierarchy to reassert itself. "You don't touch me," he said. "You hear me? This is county business." "Not one more second," Grant said. The corridor changed on that line. It was not volume, it was finality. Even the bystanders who had stayed frozen felt the hinge. The contracted therapist took one involuntary step backward and bumped the wall hard enough to rattle a framed poster about trauma-informed care. An intake worker bent, finally, to gather the spilled forms and then stopped halfway, hands shaking, as if unsure whether tidying paperwork in the middle of a child assault was the last ritual left her. Nora coughed again and found a filament of air. Bryce had shifted his knee to replant, and that micro-gap was enough for the nurse to slide 6 inches closer on tile. Inhaler now at shoulder height, body protected behind Grant's line. Transfer window opening, narrow, unstable, real. "Bryce," the deputy said, voice cracking on the name before he steadied it. "Take your hands off the child." It was the first direct command anyone in county authority had given. Bryce did not comply, but he heard it, and hearing it cost him something. His eyes widened for a beat. His left hand opened and reclosed at Nora's wrist without finding the same confident pressure. Social control was fraying at the edges now. He tried to patch it with contempt. "You're making a mistake," he told the deputy. "My father will have your stripes." The deputy swallowed, stayed where he was, and did not retract. Lena's file slipped from her grasp and hit the floor flat. Pages spread to reveal the euphemisms she had watched become policy. Dysregulated event, accidental impact, no corroborated pattern. She stared at the words like they belonged to somebody else. "Camera has his hand placement," she said, not loudly but clear enough. "It has all of it." Bryce snapped, Shut up, Lena. Grant moved another fraction forward, enough that Bryce had to turn his shoulder to keep both Grant and Nora in view. That split attention was the first tactical break. Atlas tracked it instantly, muzzle lowering, gaze locked on the hand nearest Nora's throat line. Grant's lead remained short, controlled, no slack to misread, no drag to tangle. The dog's growl stayed subterranean, a warning calibrated to behavior, not panic. Nora's fingers twitched toward the bench where her inhaler waited. She could not reach it. She looked at the toy ambulance by the wall instead, eyes glassy, and whispered something too thin to catch. The nurse leaned closer and heard enough to answer. I see it, sweetheart. Stay with me. We're right here. Her left hand hovered, not touching yet, waiting for Bryce's forearm to clear. Bryce hauled Nora's wrist a few inches and forced her shoulder back to tile. Say you fell. Grant's tone did not change. Release her. Bryce gave a breathless laugh that wasn't laughter. Or what? Grant did not answer the bait. He stepped into active engagement range, knees soft, torso angled, one hand on lead, one hand free. Atlas mirrored perfectly, weight forward but contained, body between Bryce and the semicircle of witnesses, all attention still on hands and pressure transitions. Grant's jaw set once, the old scar along it paled. He looked less like anger than like a door closing. The deputy keyed the mic again, quicker now. Need medical immediate at Hall 3. Child respiratory distress. Assault in progress on camera. His eyes never left Bryce this time. You heard me, Hartwell. Off. Now. Bryce's control strategy splintered into alternating threats and denial. She had an episode, he said toward the group. You all saw it. She slammed herself. Ask the therapist. Then louder to Grant. Get that dog back. The contracted therapist opened her mouth, then closed it. No confirmation came. An intake worker near the bench whispered a prayer under her breath and slid a plastic chair aside with her foot, clearing the nurse's path another foot. Small movement. Useful movement. The nurse shifted into that space immediately, inhaler now within one arm length of Nora's face if Bryce lifted at all. Nora's breathing deteriorated into short, high pulls. Accessory muscles at the neck, eyes tracking slower. Grant saw it and recalculated timeline in heartbeats. If Bryce clamped down again, they would lose the window. If he surged, Atlas would engage on command. If he froze, Grant would close manually. Every branch ended in action. The only variable left was order. Bryce, Grant said, each word cut clean. Take your hand off her wrist and move back. For the first time, Bryce looked uncertain about whether intimidation still worked. He glanced at the bystanders and found less compliance than he expected. Lena rigid but watching, deputy planted, nurse poised, two workers no longer pretending this was routine. The old Hartwell shield was still present. Fear, delay, calculation, but it was no longer airtight. He tried one last coercive push. He bent close to Nora's ear. Say it. You fell. Nora's lips parted. Air stuttered in. She made no cover story. Atlas's growl dropped a note lower. Grant gave a tiny leash pulse to mark boundary, then the quiet command that had carried them through noise, crowds, and worse men than this one. Steady. Atlas held, every muscle vibrating with contained force. Grant shifted forward at the same instant. Heel to toe, committed line established, pre-contact no longer abstract but imminent. The nurse lifted the inhaler into final position. The deputy took one step in from the flank, hand out, finally entering the lane. Bryce's grip faltered for a fraction. That looked like nothing and meant everything. The standoff tightened to the width of a breath. Grant read the falter in Bryce's grip and moved on it. His right hand shot to Bryce's wrist, thumb driving into the tendon line just above the watch band, while his left forearm cut across Bryce's shoulder to turn him off Nora's chest without crushing her under the shift. Atlas surged exactly to the end of lead and stopped there. Front paws planted, chest high, teeth visible for one hard second, as the growl rolled up from warning to command. The sound filled Hall 3 and pinned every witness in place. Bryce cursed and tried to wrench free. Grant rotated the captured wrist outward, not fast, not theatrical, just precise enough to break leverage and force fingers open. Nora's arm came loose first. The nurse was already there, sliding in on one knee, pulling Nora by the coat seam and underarm into the narrow pocket of space Grant had made. She moved with practiced economy, inhaler and spacer in hand, thermal blanket dragging from the bench behind her. "Mask on," the nurse whispered to Nora, fitting the spacer to her mouth while Nora coughed against plastic and shook with short, panicked pulls. "Good. Breathe with me. In. Hold. Out." Bryce twisted toward them, but Atlas rose onto locked shoulders and blocked the lane. 87 pounds of disciplined threat between Bryce and the child he had controlled for months. Grant's hand stayed on Bryce's wrist. The deputy finally closed from the flank and seized Bryce's opposite arm with both hands, face pale, jaw clenched, commitment arriving late and all at once. The hallway did not look like an office anymore. It looked like a ledger opening. Lena Ortiz stood over the spilled pages at her feet and saw every softened phrase she had helped survive review meetings, now reflected in live action under a camera dome with a red light. The therapist in gray stared at Nora's throat, at the blooming finger marks nobody could call accidental now, and pressed both hands against her own ribs as if holding herself together. One intake worker who had hidden her badge turned it outward again without seeming to realize she had done it. The county polo man backed into a wall and stayed there, eyes fixed on Atlas's muzzle like he was witnessing a truth too direct to reword. Nora was breathing, but barely. The first rescue puff hit, and she coughed hard, body folding forward into the nurse's arm. The second puff landed cleaner. Air moved deeper this time, whistling but present. Her fingers found the nurse's sleeve and locked there. Her eyes darted once to the toy ambulance near the baseboard, then to Atlas, then to Grant, then back to the spacer as if she was choosing the next second by force. Grant never looked away from Bryce's hands. He had seen men fake surrender and strike on the rebound. He had seen public rooms freeze while harm continued, because no one wanted to be first through fear. This corridor smelled like disinfectant, an old coffee and panic, but beneath it he caught the metallic note of adrenaline and the hot, bitter edge of entitlement cracking under pressure. Bryce was still talking, still trying to command the narrative through clenched teeth, still bargaining with a hierarchy that had protected him until now. "This is assault," Bryce snapped at the deputy. "You put hands on me and my father buries you." The deputy's grip tightened, then slipped, then tightened again as Bryce bucked. He looked to Grant for half a beat, as if seeking permission to stand inside his own badge. Grant gave nothing but a short instruction. "Cuff him." 3 syllables. No volume. The deputy swallowed and moved. Metal clicked once, then twice. Bryce's right wrist caught. He jerked his left arm up to block the second cuff and nearly tore free. Atlas drove one step closer, shoulders squared, and released a single bark so sharp it slapped the fluorescent hum out of the air. Bryce flinched hard enough for the deputy to secure the second cuff. Everyone heard the chain settle. A worker near interview room 2 started crying quietly and did not wipe her face. Another pulled out a phone, thought better of it, and shoved it back into a pocket. Lena bent, collected 2 pages, stopped, and read one line upside down with a fixed stare. No corroborated pattern of harm observed in placement. She shut her eyes for a second and opened them to the child on the floor, taking medicated breaths in counts of 4. Nora got a third puff, then a fourth. Color returned to the edges of her lips in uneven increments. The nurse wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders and lifted her enough to sit against the wall. Nora's hand searched blindly and found fur. Atlas had lowered to a guarded stand 6 feet away, still between her and Bryce, but when Nora's fingers brushed his coat, he angled his body just enough for contact without breaking watch. Grant saw the touch and felt his own pulse come down 1 notch. The backstory that had lived in files and whispers sat exposed in plain sight now. The first ER visit with a bruise pattern no playground fall could make. The second with wrist pain and shortness of breath. The school nurse report filed by deadline and swallowed by phrasing. The expedited clearances stamped before site visits started. The donor breakfast banner promising safety under a family name that operated like a credential and a warning. All of it had seemed separate when separated on paper. In this hallway, under 1 camera and 1 pair of cuffs, it formed one continuous line. Bryce kept pulling at the restraints like outrage could reset the scene. "Tell them," he shouted toward Nora. "Tell them you fell. You always fall." Nora looked at him through the clear spacer chamber, eyes wet but steady now, and did not speak. She turned her face into Atlas's shoulder and breathed. That silence hit harder than any argument. The deputy keyed his shoulder mic with a shaking thumb. "Suspect in custody. Hall 3, Child Advocacy Center. Assault witnessed, medical active, request supervisor and evidence tech for camera pull." His words were clipped now, report language finally aligned with reality. The radio answered with static, and then confirmation. 3 minutes out. Grant eased Bryce 1 step back from the nurse and child, then another, placing him under the camera's cleanest angle. He released the wrist lock only when the deputy had both cuffs and elbow control. Bryce spun his head toward Grant, face flushed, expensive collar pulled crooked, confidence leaking into fury. "You have no idea what you just did." Grant met his eyes for the first time since contact. No heat in it. No speech-making. Just a flat, winter-still assessment from a man who had already counted exits, witnesses, and failure points before Bryce finished his first threat. Bryce saw it and lost a shade of color. He had spent years reading hesitation and calling it authority. He knew administrators who looked away, officers who delayed, supervisors who translated obvious harm into neutral terms until the funding cycle passed. He did not know this expression. This was not performative anger, not local politics, not a man posturing for a room. It was operational calm, stripped of everything except outcome. Bryce's breathing changed when he recognized it, faster, shallower, human at last. Atlas's ears rotated toward Bryce and pinned forward again. Grant shifted his stance between them, 1 hand resting lightly at Atlas's collar. The dog stood tall now, not lunging, not pacing, front half lifted with that unmistakable readiness that made dangerous men recalculate their odds. The tan and black saddleback that turned gold in sunlight looked dark as forged metal under the county lights. "Easy," Grant said. Atlas held instantly. The hallway clock clicked once. A minute turned. No one moved to break the line. Bryce tested a smirk and failed to complete it. "My father owns this unit," he said, voice cracking at the edge. "This whole building is ours." Grant gave him 3 words. "Keep him back." It landed clean in the moment because Bryce was cuffed, still straining, and trying to angle his body toward Nora through the deputy's hold. Not a negotiation, a boundary. The deputy shifted his stance, widened his base, and pulled Bryce a half-step farther from the nurse and child. The bystanders heard the command and understood who it was for. The men with badges who had finally moved, and the room that had waited too long. Bryce laughed once, sharp and hollow. You think this sticks? Camera angles get reviewed. Reports get corrected. Ask them. He jerked his chin toward Lena, toward the therapist, toward the intake staff. They know how this works. Lena looked up from the pages in her hand, throat working, but said nothing. Her knuckles whitened around the paper edge. The therapist kept her eyes on Nora and pressed her lips together until they blanched, still rooted where she stood. The intake workers watched in rigid silence, shoulders high, faces drawn tight between fear and recognition. The county polo man did not nod this time. He stared at the floor tile and swallowed hard. The power structure did not collapse in speech in that corridor. It held itself together by habit and shock, silent and visibly cracking, waiting for whoever arrived next to force it into the record. Bryce turned back to Grant as if brute confidence could still overrun evidence. You and your dog are finished here. Grant did not blink. He warned first. The sentence was plain, almost quiet, and it did more damage than threat. Because it was true. Atlas had alerted before. Atlas had gone rigid in prior visits. Atlas had growled at the same man in the same corridor, while reports translated his behavior into irrelevance. Grant had asked for those logs and been told summaries were sufficient. He had not accepted summaries. He had filed for raw records through military K-9 assessment channels attached to volunteer security protocols. The request had gone in 2 weeks earlier. The retrieval confirmation sat time-stamped in his inbox. Bryce didn't know that yet, but he heard certainty in Grant's voice and looked, for the first time, like a man standing on ice he had assumed was concrete. Down the hallway, elevator doors opened with a chime. 2 additional deputies and a supervising lieutenant stepped out, followed by a tech with a hard case for digital extraction. Their pace slowed when they saw Atlas, then resumed when Grant gave a brief nod, and the dog remained perfectly still at heel. The lieutenant took in the scene in one sweep. Child under blanket with active inhaler protocol, suspect cuffed, primary deputy on hold, witnesses positioned, spilled files visible, camera dome overhead. Who made contact? He asked. I did, Grant said. Why? Grant answered without embellishment. Airway compromise. Lieutenant looked at Nora's neck, at Bryce's posture, at the nurse still counting breaths. He nodded once and turned to the tech. Pull corridor cam with audio, full chain, now. Then to the deputy. Read charges pending assault on a minor, obstruction, coercion, and interference with medical care. We'll add after forensic review. Bryce started to speak. The lieutenant cut him off with a raised hand. Atlas lowered his head and exhaled slowly, but he did not stand down. His gaze tracked every inch Bryce moved as the second deputy took control for transport. Nora watched the dog watch the danger and copied his breathing without knowing she was doing it. In for 4, out for 4. Her shoulders dropped another fraction. Grant crouched beside her only when Bryce was 3 full steps away and under 2-officer control. He stayed just outside her reach until she looked up and nodded. Then he moved close enough for her to anchor one small hand in Atlas's fur and the other in the thermal blanket. You're safe, the nurse said softly, administering one final puff. Nora took it, coughed once, then breathed on her own. Across from them, Bryce glanced back at Grant one last time. What he saw there was not anger and not relief. It was consequence, patient and immovable, wearing camouflage and holding a leash. The kind of presence that did not care who funded the building. For the first time all night, Bryce looked afraid. For the first time all night, Bryce looked afraid, and fear made him louder. My attorney will gut this, he snapped as the second deputy pulled him toward the elevators. You touch that footage, And my father shuts this place down." The lieutenant did not even turn his head. "Evidence tech, lock corridor cam, hall mics, and both body cams to read only. Hash now. Chain starts at 317. The tech knelt under the wall console, hard case open, gloved hands moving with practiced speed. Cables clicked in. A small printer spat labels with timestamps and checksum strings. He sealed each drive in tamper tape and called out the numbers so the deputy on log could repeat them. No one used soft words anymore. No one used maybe. Nora sat wrapped in the thermal blanket against the wall, spacers still in her hand, breathing rough but rhythmic. The nurse checked cap refill, counted respirations, then looked up at Grant. "She needs pediatric forensic, not just ER triage. I'm calling Dr. Rivas direct." "Do it," the lieutenant said. Lena Ortiz crouched to gather the spilled pages and stopped when she reached the one with the accidental fall language. Her mouth tightened. She stood, crossed to the lieutenant, and held out the file with both hands. "This one is version 4, she said. Version 1 had direct contact language. Supervisor told me to neutralize it. Name: Marjorie Haynes." Lena swallowed. "And Joel Carver on final sign-off. He made me backdate the second clearance to match donor briefing." The hallway went still in a different way. Not helpless, accounting. The therapist in gray, the one who had kept swallowing half sentences, stepped forward before courage could drain back out of her. "I omitted a line in my note," she said, voice shaking. "I observed a fear response to keys associated with caregiver approach. I coded transition stress instead. I can amend tonight. I will amend tonight." The lieutenant looked at her for one hard beat. "You will give a sworn supplement before you leave this building." She nodded, eyes wet. "Yes." By 3:29 a.m., the corridor had become a processing lane. The rust-colored crescent on the tile got photographed with scale markers, then swabbed and scraped into 2 separate evidence tubes. A facilities manager, dragged in from on-call sleep, admitted there had been a maintenance ticket to replace that tile 6 months earlier. He had closed the ticket as completed. It had not been completed. He signed that statement with a shaking hand. Grant stood at Nora's shoulder while Atlas held a downstay beside her knees, ears tracking every footstep. The toy ambulance still lay near the baseboard. Nora pointed weakly at it. The nurse retrieved it, wiped dust from the cracked light, and placed it in Nora's blanket-wrapped lap, like it was fragile evidence and sacred property at the same time. Grant's phone buzzed once against his vest pocket. Subject line: Raw K9 assessment export requested. Fort Sailor Disposition Center. He opened it, scanned the metadata, and felt his jaw set. 3 archived entries. Same location, same child, same handler note. Atlas alert, repeated rigid/fixation, and low vocalization on foster guardian Bryce Hartwell during clearance pass. Each entry marked deleted in local copy, preserved in upstream military-linked export logs with deletion user stamps from county accounts. He walked the phone to the lieutenant and held the screen out. "This is your deletion trail." The lieutenant read in silence, then handed the phone to the evidence tech. "Image this and print full header data. Now." He keyed his radio. "Patch me to on-call prosecutor." Prosecutor answered groggy and turned sharp in 10 seconds flat. The lieutenant fed him the facts: assault on camera, coercive statements, airway compromise, edited files, altered timestamps, deleted K9 alerts recovered from external logs. The prosecutor interrupted once. "Do not release anyone. I'm filing emergency remand and preservation orders before sunrise. Call state licensing and send me names." Across town, someone had already called Dalton Hartwell. He arrived at 4:02 a.m. in a dark coat over gym clothes, hair still wet from a hurried shower, outrage polished and ready. He walked past intake like the building belonged to him, and stopped cold when he saw two sealed evidence bags on the counter labeled Hartwell Placement File, V4 and Corridor Tile Sample. "My son is leaving with me," he said. "No," the lieutenant said. Dalton shifted tone, softer and meaner. "Lieutenant, you're about to make a career-ending mistake." The lieutenant slid a tablet across the desk and tapped play. Bryce's voice came through corridor audio, clear enough to cut glass. "You say you fell. You always say you fell." Dalton's face changed by degrees, color draining, then hardening back into calculation. "Audio can be contextualized." The lieutenant tapped again. Grant's command. "Nurse breathing counts." Deputy call out. "Assault in progress on camera." Then he turned the tablet and showed Dalton the recovered log entries with deletion stamps. "Your family name is now a search term in an evidence warrant." Dalton reached for the tablet. The lieutenant pulled it back. "Don't." For the first time, the Hartwell cadence broke. Dalton took out his phone, made one call, listened, then ended it without speaking. When he looked up, the old certainty was gone from his eyes. "I want counsel present." "You'll get counsel," the lieutenant said. "You won't get edits." 3 days later, in Juvenile Courtroom 2, the fluorescent hum was replaced by old wood, radiator heat, and the dry scratch of legal pads. Nora sat in a side witness room behind one-way glass with the same toy ambulance in her lap, a clean inhaler on the table, an atlas pressed close enough that she could keep 2 fingers buried in his coat, while she watched the adults decide whether truth counted this time. Grant stood behind her chair in NWU Type 3, still as a post, eyes on the glass. Inside the courtroom, every layer failed in public. The prosecutor played the corridor footage. The judge watched Bryce's hand placement twice, then once more without audio. Lena testified to directive edits and backdating pressure. The therapist read her sworn supplement in a voice that shook at first and steadied as she went. The facility's manager admitted the tile replacement ticket had been closed at instruction from administrative office staff tied to Hartwell Pavilion operations. The deputy, who had frozen, gave his statement and did not excuse himself. He said, "I saw assault and hesitated. That hesitation was wrong." The county polo worker took the stand and answered 27 questions with variations of, "I don't recall." He never did reveal what he knew. The record noted his evasions. At 10:14 a.m., the judge signed emergency removal orders, denied bond on Bryce's assault and coercion counts, and referred the file for expanded review on interference with mandated reporting and record tampering. At 10:22, State Child Services Licensing served suspension notices on Marjorie Haynes and Joel Carver, pending decertification hearings. At 10:31, the prosecutor moved to reopen 11 previously closed injury cases linked by language pattern, reviewer overlap, and timestamp anomalies. Motion granted. By the second night after the hearing, Dalton Hartwell resigned from the hospital board in a statement read by counsel, no questions taken. 48 hours after that, the hospital trustees met in a packed conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and fear. They voted to remove the Hartwell name from the pediatric wing. The new name passed unanimously after testimony from Dr. Elena Rivas, the pediatric trauma nurse who had documented Nora's injuries and cross-referenced patterns across old charts no one had wanted to line up. Late that same evening, Nora sat in a quieter room at the Advocacy Center, this time with fresh paint over the rust-stained tile section and a new camera dome blinking red over a corridor that no longer pretended not to see. Her breathing was even. One sneaker was on, one tucked beside her chair out of habit. She traced the cracked light on the toy ambulance, then looked up at Atlas. "Atlas," she whispered, like she was testing whether a safe thing could stay. Atlas lifted his head at the sound of his name and leaned in until his forehead rested against her shoulder. Grant knelt in front of them, not touching until Nora reached first. She put her small hand over his scarred knuckles, then moved it back to Atlas's neck and stayed there. Atlas turned, pressed his head into Grant's chest for one long breath, then returned to Nora, dividing his weight between them as if he could anchor both at once. The nurse watched from the doorway and said nothing. Nothing needed translating. The inhaler from the hallway was logged and replaced. The toy ambulance was photographed for the file and released back to Nora's custody as a comfort item. The raw K9 export, corridor audio, body cam footage, swab results, and amended reports were all entered, indexed, and locked under preservation order. Ms. Delaney, the school nurse whose report had been buried, got a direct call back from the prosecutor and cried when she heard the cases were reopened. The line in the chart that once read accidental fall remained visible in the record, now marked superseded by forensic finding and court order. Atlas had alerted on the truth before anyone else did. This time, the truth stayed in the file. When Grant finally rose to leave, Nora kept one hand in Atlas's coat and looked at the door without flinching at the keys on the guard's belt. It was a small thing. It was the whole thing. Outside, dawn came up cold over county brick and glass, and inside, for once, the system moved in the same direction as the child.